Hello and welcome to our fourth tutorial. And in this tutorial, I want to introduce JavaScript, which is kind of like the third part of our client-side programming tools. So in the earlier tutorials, we talked about HTML, we talked about CSS. Those two are primarily used for kind of setting up what the look is on the window. So if you recall, HTML is kind of like the structure. It provides the hierarchy of our file and essentially says what is being displayed on the browser, whereas CSS are all the rules surrounding how I'm going to display all of these elements. So all the rules containing colors, sizes, locations, like location on the page, and so on. Okay, and so what we want to do here is go on a little bit further and talk a little bit more dynamically about what we can add to our page. Now, when I say dynamic, it means that I already have the page on the browser. Okay, so I just want to come here and show you one example of this. So this is my localhost 5000. I just want to show you that I am currently running this locally, so Heroku local. In fact, I haven't pushed anything since my last tutorial. Um, so what I mean by dynamic is that we have the setup for the page. Okay, so what if I wanted to add more functionality to the page, but I want to apply those changes dynamically. Sorry, locally. So what I mean by this is, what if I wanted to kind of roll my mouse over a specific image, and for that image to change, or I want some action uh, uh, to be invoked when I do certain interaction with the web page. So for example, if I move the mouse, that would be an event. Okay, that would be some interaction that I have with the browser. If I click on a specific part of the web page, if I drag along the web page, if I hit a key when I'm over a specific element, these are all ways that I can interact with the browser. I want to set up a set of rules as to what the browser is going to do when I invoke these events. So when I do this interaction with the browser, what do I want the browser to do as a result? So, uh, so I've set up a page here, which is called myform.html. And right now it's pretty simple. It's linking to a CSS file. It has a form that has an input of text and input of number, and it has a button. So it has those three elements in it. So if we take a look at what this looks like, myform.html basically looks like this. Now, the best way to talk about JavaScript is probably to go into this inspect function in our browser and go under console. Console is basically the interpreter for JavaScript. Okay, so think of this as kind of like idle for Python. So anytime we type in something here, then dynamically this is going to be updated on our web page, and this also gives us a little bit of um, tools to be able to play around with what's in JavaScript as well. Okay, so let's talk about how we can link our HTML file to JavaScript. All right, so there's a tag called script. Probably the most basic way that we can type up some script is we can put JavaScript directly in here. Okay, so all our JavaScript commands can go in here, and it's very similar to what I explained earlier about the style tag. Okay, so if we had the style tag, everything in here is understood as CSS, and here everything in within the script tag is understood as JavaScript. All right, so instead of doing this, I will actually link the script tag using an attribute called source. All right, so I'm going to say that from here, I have this script.js. A JavaScript file is typically has a js.js to indicate that this is a JavaScript file. So I'm going to create this file. I'm going to call this script.js. And now I can type in everything associated with our script with the dynamic script here. Okay, so we can put all of our JavaScript there. Now, the location in which we put our JavaScript also makes a difference. So for example, if I put JavaScript, if I put my script tag here versus if I put my script tag right before the end of the body, this makes a difference because as the browser reads our HTML file, it will execute the script kind of sequentially. So if I had my script tag up here, then it would have executed the script here. But the problem with that is it doesn't know what the hierarchy is, right? So I haven't defined this hierarchy as body and then h1 as a child and form as another child. And then underneath that, we have input as another child. So we don't have this notion of the hierarchy. But if we put our script at the end, now that hierarchy exists. So this is one thing that we should keep in mind when we're programming, and we should know where to put our scripts. I would say typically, I do say typically, we will put our scripts at the end of the HTML file, just because most of the time we need this hierarchy to be defined before we actually do some scripting. All right, so how do we do input and output in JavaScript? So we've already linked to this file called script.js. Okay, so let's just begin by typing some basic functionality. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can declare variables in JavaScript. Okay, the first one that I'll start off with is called var. Okay, so when we do something like var a is equal to. Okay, so when we do var a is equal to, and then we can assign something that goes with it. So we can do var a is equal to 9. Right? And this is going to give the number 9 to the variable a. So then I can do something like console.log and then a. Now, when we do this, we're basically saying take the variable a and log it onto the console. So this is the console window. It's kind of like printing. We typically use console.logs to give feedback, to do some testing, or to output some temporary values just to make sure that we have the right values and so on when we do programming. So when we do the console.log a, and then we're going to get this number 9. And JavaScript is a dynamically typed programming language, so we can overwrite this with hello world. You can see that I already done that before. So a is equal to hello world, and now I can do console.log a again, and it's going to give me hello world. So it's going to be dynamically typed, and in fact, typing is one of the things that we should note in JavaScript, because the purpose of having JavaScript is that we're working with the browser and the inputs of the browser. So we have to really be careful of what types we're working in JavaScript, but yet it is still kind of in a weakly typed language. All right, so getting back to our example, how do we do input-output in JavaScript? So the first thing that we would do is, or one way that we can do this is we can do a prompt and we can do an alert. So I can do something like var a is equal to window.prompt, and we can do tell me your name. Okay, so this is the prompt. It's going to prompt the user for tell me your name, and I'm going to give it an initial value. So the second parameter here is initial value. So if the person doesn't type in anything, then their default is name. Then I'm going to do a window.alert, and I'm just going to say hello, and then plus a. So this is a string concatenation. I'm going to concatenate with their name, and I'm going to do a window.alert. All right, so what you have to understand about JavaScript is that everything in JavaScript is an object. Okay, so we use this dot notation quite a bit in JavaScript. So what we're seeing here is that we have a object called window. And I hope this is intuitive because the window object is referring to our whole window, whole browser window, and we can provide a prompt. There is a prompt function, and we're calling that prompt function. Okay, so again, everything in JavaScript that we're going to either program or invoke are going to be as a result of calling these multi-layers of these objects. So similarly, this window object has the function called alert as well. And whatever we pass in the string, it will form a window alert. So let's just see what this does. I'm just going to do a refresh. So you see, tell me your name, and then you type in your name. This is your prompt. And then when we say OK, it's going to say hello. And then whatever that variable was, just basically regurgitated onto the page. All right. So as interesting as this is typically not the way that in JavaScript we do input-output. Okay, so typically in JavaScript we do input-output via information that's already on our web page. Okay, so typically we don't prompt the user for inputs, and we rarely do window alerts. Now I do say rarely just because this functionality can be disabled, and it's very annoying. So we typically don't do window alerts, but instead we do dynamic feedback to the user, basically via this page. All right, so let's next talk about how to do this. It turns out that we can grab these elements that are in this hierarchy using multiple ways. So the typical way to grab an element would be from the document. So if we do document and then dot, we can actually get the elements using different forms. So we can do get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by name, and so on. If we jump over to my form, I've earlier labeled my button with the ID button. So I'm going to get element by ID, and this is a function that expects the ID of the HTML element that I've named. So if I do button, this refers to the ID button on my HTML document. So if I call this var, call it var B, then B is actually referring to this button here. So so there's a lot of attributes and functions that go along with this particular element, this particular object in JavaScript. One example would be .inner HTML. Now, I know you see inner text and inner HTML here. Typically, we use inner HTML because if I want to add some other tags inside of this current tag, then I could do that. But basically, inner HTML is referring to the content that's inside of this tag. Right now it says add, but instead of add, maybe I want to say, I don't know, add user, just to be a little bit more specific. So I can do b inner HTML is equal to add user, and essentially we've dynamically changed what is being displayed on our HTML. And we can do this dynamically with pretty much every element. So you're going to have to play around with some of these elements and what kind of attributes, what kind of functions are there. But essentially, this is what one of the things that JavaScript would be good for. So let's talk about being able to change certain parts of the HTML, as well as being able to grab values from the HTML. So earlier I showed you prompting as well as alerting through the window. I said this typically is not the way to do things. So one other way that we can do this is, let me just show you another way that we can grab some information from the HTML. So let's say we do var, and then let's call this t. I'm not very descriptive with my variables, I apologize, but I want to name a variable t, and t is going to be document dot, and then I'm going to do query selector all. Okay, so this is actually a very important, very useful tool. I mean, I use this quite a bit. Um, so the query selector all accepts a selector in the form of CSS. So it accepts a CSS selector. So for example, if I do text, type equals text. So I hope you remember in our CSS section, I talked about what this selector does. It looks for all the elements that have a type equal to text. And in this case, we are basically specifying that. But you could probably imagine that there's more than one element in HTML here that is going to have type text. So when we do query selector all, we're basically taking all of them. Okay, so the result of this T is that it's going to be a node list. So a node list is really just, it functions very similar to an array. And at least for now, I'm going to pretend that it's an array because I'm going to index each one of it. So, so T0, right, is going to give me this input. I can do T0 and then dot. And now notice that in here, we have this thing called value. Right now, by default, the value is equal to 0, but essentially value is whatever the person types in into the input. So right now, if I do value, I want you to see that it's empty, right? It's an empty string that we're getting. So depending on whatever the person types in, let's say they type in Bobby, and I do t0.value, it's going to give me that value. So this is probably the more important or the more useful way of collecting input from HTML dynamically, at least on a client side. So whatever the person currently has, right? So age 23, whatever they currently have, that is going to be the value that's going to be taken from that element. Okay, so so that just for our sake, let's do another one. So var c, I'm going to take, well, actually, yeah, var c is equal to document, and let's see, we do get element by name. Let's do get element. Let's do get elements by tag name. All right, so tag name, I'm going to use input as the tag name. And now, again, you can see that I have multiple inputs here, right? So it's going to grab all of them. And C, you can see is a HTML collection with, here we have 2 of them, which is referring to both of these inputs. Okay, so if I do C0, I'm referring to this first input. If I'm referring to C1, I'm referring to this input. Now, just as an aside, if I do C0, it's basically the same as if I do T0. Okay, so I've grabbed exactly the same element there. But I'm going to grab the second element here, and I'm going to do dot value. And you can see that the value is 23. Okay, so this is important because we have multiple ways that we can grab very specific things on our HTML. So probably the one that you're going to use the most is ID, but I want you to be aware of all the other ones as well. So play around with those and try to get to learn different ways that we can grab the elements that are from our HTML file. Okay, so this is just a few things that we can do with the HTML. Sorry, with basic JavaScript. I also want to show you that there are ways in JavaScript that we can do comparisons as well. So, so you see here, 23 is actually a string. So we take this as a string 23. If we wanted to make a comparison between the values, if I do 23, right, there's an equal symbol in JavaScript. So is 23 equal to C1.value? And the answer is true. Well, wait a minute. This is a number, and this was a string that we applied here. So so the equal actually in JavaScript is just comparing what those numbers are. So even if it's a integer compared with a string, if they have the same value, then it's true. Now, on the other hand, there is another comparison operator, which is the triple equal, which has to equal in the value as well as its type. Now here, 23 is a type number, and here the 23 is a string, so this is not equal. Okay, so this is just a stricter way that we can compare um, JavaScript in JavaScript. All right, so similarly, there is a not equal and there's a not equal equal. Okay, so that's basically how we do comparisons in JavaScript. So continuing on, let's talk a little bit about functions in JavaScript. So I'm going to jump back to my script here. This out, and functions in JavaScript can be written in two ways. Well, actually, many ways. But the basic syntax for a function is we use the keyword function, and there's a couple of ways that we can express the name of the function. So, for example, if I do func1, and here we're basically calling this function func1, and we can add as many parameters in here as we want. So A, B, C, whatever, right? So these are the inputs of func1. And we can do a return, but here I'm just going to do a very simple function. I'm just going to log A plus B plus C. Okay, so I'm just going to put this into the console. And another way that we can define a function is we can do something like func2. Let's give it a variable name. Now remember, I said everything in JavaScript is a is an object, so this function is actually in effect an object. So we can assign it to a variable called func2. So we can do something like console log and then hello world. The difference between these two is that this function definition happens, you can imagine, happens at the very beginning of the file. So it has the full understanding of what this function does at the very beginning, whereas this, because we're assigning it to a variable, it doesn't get assigned until the whole script gets processed. So just to show you what I mean by this, or sorry, not the whole script, but until this line of code gets processed. So if I call func1, and this is how I would call this function, and I also call func2. Func1, of course, we need some parameters. So 1, 2, 3. So if I make this function call is going to work because this function is understood as defined at the very beginning. Right, so it kind of boosts the definition up to the top, whereas this func2 at this point in the call, because it's an object that is assigned later on in the code, it won't know that that it exists. So if I just very quickly run this, you'll see that it says that it is not a function. Okay, so if we just bring this line down to here, then it'll be able to print it out. Okay, now this is how we refer to functions. So I just did this first example just to show you, when functions actually exist. Okay, if we go back to our code and we do something like type of, and then func1. Okay, so it's going to tell you basically that this is a function. If we do func2, this is a function, right? So, so a function is a type of object that is found in JavaScript. Similarly, if we do type of 3, it's a number. Type of 3.123 is a number, and we have like hello. Type of hello is a string. Okay, so So we can differentiate between types in JavaScript as well. Now, I didn't make mention of this earlier when I showed you the equals and the triple equals, and those are testing for value as well as types in themselves. There are conversions that we can make. I'm not going to go through every detail here, but there is a command called parseInt and parse float, which allows us to be able to turn strings into integers, and they work very similar to other high-level language programs. All right, so moving on, if we have these functions, we can actually use them for different purposes. So we said that when we invoke a function, we're basically executing what's inside here. Okay, so what the usefulness of these functions is that I can provide a function definition, and I can say that I'm going to use it as what we call a callback. Okay, what we call a callback function. I'll show you some examples of this, although we really won't see useful examples until we get to Node, until our demo on Node. But let me just show you a simple example. We have these arrays. So let's see if I can, maybe I'll define it here. Let's say I make a variable ARR, and that is equal to let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so this is an array that I'm creating in JavaScript, and I can go through this array in in a very similar manner than a lot of high-level languages. I can use a for loop. All right, so I can use for I equals 0, I is less than ARR dot length, and then I plus plus, and I can do a console.log ARR at I. Okay, so I can just as easily go through this with the for loop, and that's what it prints out. Other things that we can do with an array, if I just, let's see, let me just randomize some of these numbers here. All right, so if I do something like this, I can take the array and I can sort the array. So the way that I can sort the array is I can do something like ARR and then dot sort. And this is going to sort the array. Now, after I sort the array, I'm going to print it out and I'm going to see what happens. All right, so you can see that after I invoke the sort, the order is definitely different, okay? But it doesn't look like it's sorted. Now, the reason is because the default with working with arrays in JavaScript is that it looks at the kind of the ASCII values, even though they are numbers as they are represented. But the default way of sorting in JavaScript actually sorts the first number, and then the second number, and the third number, and so on. Okay, so obviously there are ways that we can adjust this sort, and this is what I want to show you in terms of functions. So I'm going to, maybe I'll comment this out, comment all of these things out first. A little bit better job of commenting here. All right, so the way that we can sort this is we can apply a function to it. So let's call it a function, and then I'm going to call it ascending function. All right, so ascending function is going to take in two inputs, A and B, and I'm going to return A minus B. All right, so the purpose of this function is that I'm going to, whenever I do this sort, I want to use this function as my comparison function. So, so remember what we said, this is an object, and as an object, I can pass this in into my function call of sort. So the way we can do this is I'm going to call sort on the array. I'm going to use the ascending function, and this is our first example of a callback. So a callback function is basically that as I execute a function, okay, I'm going to wait till the function finishes or requires extra information, and I'm going to pass that extra information in it, and it could be in the form of a function. Now, all of us remember sort from 125. So sort is whenever we do sort, we need a comparison of some kind. So this is a comparison function that we're going to pass in, and this is a callback in JavaScript, because as we do this sorting, we need to call back to this function in order to execute it and use its commands. Okay, so this is how we would be able to use a function. Or this is one usefulness of a function. Oh, didn't save it. All right, so we do this, and now it uses that sorting function. Now, similarly, we can do descending, right? You can probably guess how we can do descending, and so on. Okay. Now, just as a final example here of arrays, and again, I know I'm leaving a lot of details out, but another way that we can write a for loop for an array is we can do a for, and then say item in array. Okay, so for all the items in array, I'm going to console.log the array and item. All right, so item here is going to give us the index, and it's going to console.log each one of them, and hopefully this works. This will give me the exact same for loop. Okay, so the way that we can index arrays, as we saw before, is that we can do ARR, and then 0 will give us each one of these indexes. And earlier when we did get element by name, or get elements by name, if you recall, that was a collection, an HTML collection, and they work exactly in the same way. So they can be indexed using the index 0, 1, 2, and so on. And there's for loops that go with that as well. Okay, I just wanted to kind of let you know of that point. Okay, so let's just do one more example. I mean, there's lots of examples that I've put in the slides, but let's do one more example of callback functions, just so we're kind of clear on the idea. So there is a function called every. So an array. So right now I have array. Let me comment this out. I have array, and there is a every function. So I want some specific property about every one of these numbers. Okay, so if it's true about every one of these numbers, then then it's going to pass back true. But if it's not true about every one of these numbers, then it's going to pass back false. So so now, just in this situation, I want to give you another way that I can express a function. So here, I'm actually calling the function ascending, ASC. And here, I'm actually calling the function func2. So there are a lot of times when we can have anonymous functions. So let's say this function is really going to be used only once in our code. There's no point in naming that object. So an anonymous function just does function. And in fact, there is actually a shorter notation that I'll show you in 1 second. I can do function, and then I'm going to give it value. All right, so this value is going to represent all of these values that are in this array. For every one of these values, I want to execute something. Okay, so so I want to execute the code, and I'm going to return whether or not this value is, let's see, greater than 3. All right, now you see that every value is greater than 3, so I would expect that for every one of these values, this would be true, and so every one of those elements would be true, and I would expect this this array.every to return true. All right, so let's put a variable there. So variable, we'll call it x. And then we'll do this console.log x. Okay, and we'll see what gets printed out as a result of this function. All right, so it's going to print true. Whereas if I said every one of the values is greater than 7, that would not be true because there's a 5 there, and that would be false. All right, so in the same way, there are very similar functions. You can look those up in JavaScript called for each, filter, map, sum. So instead of every, we have sum. And much of those work in the same way. So I just want us to be familiar with the way that we typically write JavaScript code. And sometimes whenever we need a function, we don't actually need to pass in the function definition. We can just pass in the anonymous, sorry, the function name. We can just pass in the anonymous function definition. All right. So the next thing I wanted to get into here. All right, so we've talked about functions, and so next let's talk a little bit about objects. Okay, so we can create objects in JavaScript as well. Now we've already seen some examples of objects. We saw the window object, we saw the console object, so console.log, and we saw objects in which we grab the elements and we said, you know, these elements have this property called inner HTML, and we were able to change some of that. We saw those in previous examples, but now let's talk a little bit about objects. Okay, so this was our section on arrays. Keep that there. I will be uploading this code, by the way, so you can have a look at this as I finish. So objects. All right, so discussing objects, it's probably we first need to understand how JavaScript would look at objects. So as I said, everything in JavaScript is represented as an object, whether it be just basic values or arrays or functions or anything like that, right? So anything in your browser can be represented as an object. So when we actually program, we are also working with objects. So for example, if we make a database call, right, later on we'll talk about how to do that. If I make a database call and there's some data that comes back, chances are we're going to need to formulate it in terms of objects so that we can work with it dynamically on our page. So that's where objects come into play, at least objects that we create come into play. So let's start off by creating an object called person. Okay, so we'd say var person, and you see, it's just like any other variable that we create. The notation that we would use is we would use this open and close squiggly bracket, and in short, everything that's inside, we're going to write in the form of a JSON form. Okay, so it's JSON form. Now, I'm just gonna go through some rules of JSON form, just so we're familiar with seeing this. But as we go on in the course, we're gonna see this a lot. We're gonna see this form a lot. So, so let's say this person has a first name. Okay, this first name, and let's call them Bob. And this person also has a last name, Smith. Comma here. We're making an object. So the attributes can just be listed, right, as something like this. They could have an ID, and let's say their ID is 5555. And notice that this is an integer, or sorry, this is a number. These are strings. Now, we could also specify directly in this object functions as well. So I can say, let's say full name is a function. So full name, you see, I'm going to use, I'm sorry, I'm using wrong notation here. So first name is colon. So you see the different color notation here. Okay, so full name, and I can specify that this is a function. You see, this is a string, this is a string, this is a number, this is a function. So let's see, I'm going to take function, and then yeah, so I don't need any inputs here. I basically want this function to return the full name of this person. So so whatever this object is, this dot first name, and then I'm going to concatenate this with a space, and then this dot last name. All right, so I'm going to return this as a function. Right. So basically, this is my object. Now, the good thing about JavaScript is that I can dynamically add functions and I can dynamically add attributes to this object. So if I run this, for example, I can refer to person, right? So person, there's this object here, right? But I can do person dot, and then I can invoke this full name, right? So this is going to print out for me Bob Smith. So I presumably I would do console.log or whatever I need to do with it, but this will return for me this string of the person's full name. Now, in the same way, if dynamically I want to program to, I want this program to be able to add some other features to this person, I can do person and then dot, and I don't know, age, right, is equal to 33. All right, so now if I take a look at person should have an age with 33, and we can dynamically add other objects in here as well. So this is how we would work with an object, but what if we wanted to work with like a class of objects? Okay, so here's another thing that we can create. We can kind of create this, this function that is kind of like a constructor for a person. So I can be a little bit more abstract with this. I can have it on a higher level. We can do function, and then I can call it person, right? And this person is going to need a first name, a last name. I don't know, what else do we? Maybe an ID and an age. Okay, so let's do something like this. And so we can do something like this dot first name is equal to F. We can do this dot last name is equal to L, and so on, right? So this dot age is equal to the age, and then this dot ID is equal to the I. Now, I can do other things as well, right? I can specify a function to be passed in or anything like that. But let's comment this part out, and now we can just work with something like this. Now, this function is defining that we have a person, right, that creates itself a new object. Okay, so this is actually key here, because this is specifying that this itself is an object. So in order to create this object, I have to invoke this keyword called new. So let me run this, and I can do var, and then I don't know, person1 is equal to, and then I'm going to invoke the word new and person. And for person, I need to pass in first name, last name, ID, and age. Okay, so first name, and ID 1, 2, 3, 4, and then an age, right? So something like that. And now we can work with this person. And in the same way, I can add other attributes to this person as well, right? So I can do yeah, anyways, you get the idea, right? So I can do full name. I can add full name to this is equal to function, da, 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 da. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you here is how all of this kind of fits in with arrays. So if we make another person, oops, let's make another person. So person 2, we'll say, is a new person, and this is going to be John Smith. Okay, let's say they have the exact same ID and age. Doesn't matter. Okay, so we can create an array called A var a is just an array. Right now it's an empty array. We can do a dot, there's a command called push for an array. So I'm going to push person1 into the array, and then I'm going to do a dot push, and then person2 into the array. And now we have person1 and person2. Now notice that these objects are referred to as person. Right. Typically, when you have a console printout, they only print out kind of the highest level of the object. So if this is a person object, it would say it's a person. If it's an array, it would say array. But notice right now we have an array of objects. So how this array of objects looks like, actually, let me do console.log here. All right. So you can see that this is, this is the first person, this is the second person, and you can imagine that this is, with square brackets, right? So this is our first object, second object. If we wanted to kind of work with this object in some way, so I can take person1 and, okay, we'll say person1 string. All right, so this is person1 string. So person1 string, there is a command called stringify. Okay, so JSON, so capital letter JSON. This is an object that is on the highest level of JavaScript. So JSON dot stringify, and I can pass in an object. So for example, I can pass in person1, right? And now if we take a look at person1 string, you see, this is a string associated with that object. So it takes that object and it turns it into a string. Now, what's the purpose of this? So let's say when we're programming and we want to pass, pass some object from JavaScript over to a server. Well, the only way we can do that is to pass a string over, right? So stringifying something is basically taking the information from an object and turning it into a string form. Okay. Now, on the other hand, we can do the opposite operation, which is taking a string and putting it back into an object form. So I hope you understand what I mean by object form, because if I do, person1 string, and then I say dot first name, okay. So this doesn't make sense because it doesn't have an attribute first name. It's just a string. Okay, so if I want to take this string and I want to turn it back into an object, so I'm going to do person1 object. Okay, the person1 object is equal to person1 string, and then the opposite operation is called, I forgot what it is. I think it's called parse. I think it's a JSON parse. JSON dot, there we go, parse. I'm going to parse this string, and parsing means I'm going to take this string. The information should be in the form of a JSON object, which is something like this, right? Oh, by the way, JSON objects always have the form of property colon value, right? So property colon value, and then comma, property colon value, comma, and so on. Okay, and even if they're functions, right? So a function would have its property and then its definition. Okay. So now, if we take a look at person1 object, it's in an object that we can work with, and we can invoke first name, for example, and it would give me Jane. Okay, so so this is, just some very basic things that we can work with in JavaScript. All right, so next, what we want to do is talk a little bit about the actions, the events that take place in our HTML when we do interaction with our web page. I want to be able to define some actions that go along with these events. So for example, if I click on this button, I want something to happen. Okay, so JavaScript is always actively listening for these types of events. So when I interact somehow with my web page, if I hit a button on my keyboard, if I click somewhere on the page, if I drag or anything like that, I can attach actions to go along with that. So that's the next thing I want to talk about. So the first thing we have to do for assigning actions associated with events is we have to select the element itself. Okay, so if we so there was a button here with an ID button. Okay, so we can do document dot get element by ID, and let's get the element button. All right, so let's work with that. So get element by ID button, and I'm going to make this bar B. All right, so B, this button has things that we can associate with it in terms of events. So events, typically, there's lots of different events in JavaScript, and they typically follow the word on. Okay, so you see on all of these things. Okay, so you can take a look at all of those. I'm going to go with the easiest one. I'm going to do on click. So on click is basically the action of me clicking on this button. Now, to be specific, clicking means I press on the on a button and then I release. That's called a click event. Now, it doesn't specify which click, so any click on this button would invoke some event. Okay, right now it's null, so that means when I click on this, nothing happens. Nothing happens to this button. But I want to associate something to happen on this, and I'm going to associate a function to go with it. So the function is oh, by the way, when I have a when I invoke a command, when I invoke an action, typically there are events that happen. Okay, so the event is an object that is passed into this function. Okay, so let's just take a look at what's happening after. I'm going to do console.log, and for now, let's just do hello. All right, so I just want to go through exactly what happens in this definition. So first, I took the element button, and then I said on click, I want to invoke this function. So this is a callback function. Every time I click on this, it's going to call this function. It has an input of event, but I haven't used it in the function definition. All I did was console.log and then hello. So now when I click this, it'll say hello, and this, this thing keeps track of the every time I click, and then it'll output hello onto the console. Okay, so earlier I said that there are the events. So I'm not sure if I can do this, but let's just do this command one more time. And instead of printing hello, let's print out event. Let's see what happens. I think you're just going to see an object, but let's define this. And now when I click on it, okay, you actually see a little bit more than that. But so if you can see what this event basically is, this object event. So this is a mouse event, and there's all of these attributes that happen with this mouse event, right? So it specifically, which button it was. So what button did I press? What was the XY coordinate? And all of these as well. So you can have a look at all of those and play around with it. And for the different different places that I click on it, different actions, what types of events get recorded. Okay, so that's basically the event. So so let's go back one more. Let's just make another function here. I'm going to console.log the event dot. There was a client X. Okay. So well, let's do client X as well as client Y. Okay. So so it's going to basically tell me what the coordinates of that click was. So okay, so I'm just gonna define this, and then you see that every time I click, it's going to give me an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, right? So wherever I click on this button, it's going to tell me exactly where on the screen I've clicked on this button. Okay. Now, of course, I can. I don't only need to add this to the button, I can add it to the window as well. So I think for window, this might be a better better application, right? So where on the window did I actually click? And that's probably going to be a basis for a lot of the games maybe that we can write for JavaScript, the client-side games that we can write for JavaScript. All right, so let's do something a little bit more interesting than this. So maybe one thing that I can do, and let me just let me comment all of these other things out again. All right, so here I'm going to do event handlers. All right, so by the way, what I just wrote there as a function is called an event handler. All right, so let's do something more than this. So I'm going to do document dot get element by ID. So you notice one of the things about typing this out is if we're typing it out into a script, it doesn't really give us the autocomplete. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to, you might make some typing mistakes or anything like that, right? So we got to be very careful about that. So document dot get element by ID, and then we want to get the button, and then I'm going to do dot, and then on click. So on click, I want to associate with this function called, I don't know, we'll just call it run command. So we'll do run command, and I'm going to, and I'm going to define run command. In fact, let's define it up here. Function run command, and then when we run the command, what I want to do is take this part, and let me just find what that part is. So that is an h1 tag. All right, so let's, when I run this function, I want to do a document dot get elements. Let's just, I don't want to make a mistake here, so I just want to do document dot get elements by tag name. I didn't want to type it in wrong. So h1. Okay, so I just want to make sure that this actually grabs this thing. All right, so I want to grab that element. And this is going to give for me an array because it says get elements. So I'm going to do 0 to grab the first element. And then I'm going to say dot. And what can I do to this? Well, let's just dot inner HTML. Okay, equal to. So I don't want to say users. I just want to say, be a little bit more specific and say add users. Okay, so I just want to make that change. So when I click on this button, I want this thing to change. Now, in the same way, I could have grabbed the exact same element here, right? And I could have changed that inner HTML as well. So it's up to you what you want to do. Hint, hint for the assignment. So let's run this, and now we have basically, you know, defined that define this thing, and when we click on this, it's now turns into add users. Okay, so you can be creative with this, right? So we can set flags, right? So we can set global flags. I'll talk about globals in the next video, but we can set global flags, and we can make a toggle between these two, between add users and add or users or something like that, right? So, so we can be creative with this. Now, I didn't want to lose that last thing that we did, but if you remember the all of those setting, oh shoot, I think I lost those. Oh yes, so remember before we said B and then on click, and then I did a function and then the event and then console.log hello, right? But then after that, I invoke this command, which says console.log and then the event. And then I did this command, which prints out the client X as well as the client Y. So one thing that you may have been wondering is, wait a minute, I did those sequentially. So why is it that this button, the function that's attached to this button got overwritten every single time, right? So why is it that when I clicked add, that only the client X and client Y appeared and the hello no longer appeared? So you may have guessed that what I did there was overwrite the functionality for this onClick. Okay, and this is what we call an event handler. So when we associate a function with onClick with that event, only one event could happen. So only one event handler can happen with a particular element in HTML. So I'll show you another example here. If I did instead onClick and then I gave it another functionality. Okay, so if I did function and then the event, and then I did, yeah, let's just do console.log. And then hello. Okay, if I did something like this. All right, so you'll realize that when I click on this, it'll only invoke hello, right? It's not going to change the add users, right? So this essentially, this function has overwritten this function. Okay, so you can only apply one event handler per element. While we're here, here's a shorthand that I'll typically use for a function. So instead of typing out the word function, if this is an anonymous function, there's a shorthand in JavaScript that just says, I have the input event. I know it's a function. I have an input event, and this is defining this function. Okay, so I will typically use this notation from now on, just because I don't want to keep typing up the word function. All right, so let me comment this out, and we'll keep this as is. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, well, wait a minute. What if I wanted to attach many events to the same element? So here's where event listeners come in. Okay, so event listeners are things that are commands that we can add multiple of them to the same element. So the difference between an event handler and an event listener is that the event listener is, well, you can think of it as the JavaScript side, that we're actively listening for events and we're applying everything that applies, all the listeners for a particular event. Now, another way to explain this, and perhaps this is a little bit more technical of an explanation, is that when we actually interact with a specific element. So if you take a look at this add button, basically what's happening here is we have a window, so we have the body, right? And inside that body, if I click over here, oops. If I click over here, inside that body we have a form, and inside that form we have a button, right? So this is the hierarchy that's taking place here. So this is the body. This is the body here, and then inside there's a form, right? And inside there's a button. And this is basically what you're looking at there. So when we click on this button, there's basically a drilling down of this hierarchy. So we're going through the body. So the first thing that registers is that we're clicking on the body. But more specifically, we are clicking on the form. And then, sorry, let's do this. And then more specifically than that, we're clicking on the button. So there's actually many hierarchies here. So then the actual clicking of the button, right, is the action, right? So that is the actual action. And the action is what gets attached to the handler. Okay, so the handler is what happens when this button gets clicked. That's all we're defining. But there's actually many phases. There's this phase that we can drill down into the button. There's the actual clicking of the button, but there's actually, there are also other phases. There's another phase that comes back up. Now going down, we call this the capture phase, okay? And coming up, we call this the bubbling phase. Okay, so there's the capture, there's the action, the action is the actual clicking of the button, and then there's the bubbling phase that goes back up to the top. There's actually another layer here, which is the window itself, but I'm just simplifying this, this example. So the difference between a handler and an event listener, which we're about to talk about, is that a listener listens for this whole phase, like this whole all of these actions that are occurring here. Okay, so in short, I guess the part that we have to understand as a programmer is that event listeners, you can apply more than one to it. Okay, so let's talk about how we can define event listeners. So so again, I'm just going to get element by ID and then the button. Okay, so so here I'm just going to show you two event listeners. I'm going to do two event listeners, and show you that both of them actually get invoked. All right, so the keyword here is I'm going to add event listener, and event listener here, we have to define a function. So in the same way as what we did here, we can define a function. Now I'm going to define a anonymous function. So the first thing we need to do is we need to provide it some inputs. Now the inputs, we're going to need the event itself. Okay, so we haven't said on what, right? So what is the event? The event is called click. There are other events, right? Like mouse down, mouse up, mouse scroll, left click, right click. All of these are events that JavaScript could listen for. But here I'm just going to listen for the click event. My apologies. It's the first parameter is click event, and then the second parameter is the function. Okay, so I'm listening for the click event, and then when the click event happens, this function is going to fire. So so again, let's do the event, and then it's going to have this function. So let's just do console.log just to show you what's happening here. So console.log, and I'm just going to do hello. All right, and the second event listener that I'm going to put is I'm going to do the same thing on click. I'm going to do hello and then world. Okay, so what you're going to see is both of these events, both of these listeners are going to get invoked. All right, so we'll run this, and now when we click on the add, it's going to do hello and then world. So you'll notice that it does do it in this order because by default, the event listener is going to listen for the capture phase. Okay, now there's a lot more that I can talk about. You can actually have these events listen for the bubbling phase instead of the capture phase. And this gets us a lot more flexibility in terms of what types of listening events we want to listen for. Okay, but I don't want to really go into that in kind of the basic JavaScript section. All right, so let's do one more example here. I'm going to do the window object, and I'm going to do a window and then add event listener. And this time I'm going to listen for a key press. Okay, so key press is basically on my keyboard, I'm hitting a button or hitting one of the keys. All right, so again, I'm going to, with this key press, I have an event, and this is going to fire this function. This function, well, let's just do console.log, and then the event, and then we'll do key code. All right, so key.keycode, you can probably guess what this is. The event that's being fired is a keyboard button press, and this is the code associated with the button. It turns out that every button on your keyboard has a unique key code, and we can program what to do based on that code. Okay, so if the code is blah, 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 then do this. If the code is blah, 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 then do this, right? So you can probably imagine that you have a lot of functions to play with here. All right, so let's see if I made any mistakes here. All right, so I'm on the window. I'm gonna press the B button. It's 98. This is the capital A. This is the small a. This is the capital R. This is the small r. Okay, so so you can see it prints out the key code associated with all of the keys that I'm pressing. All right, so I think this is all I wanted to talk about in terms of basic JavaScript. So in our next tutorial, probably next week, what we'll do is talk a little bit more about advanced JavaScript. I hope I've covered enough for you to complete the assignment here. But of course, there's a lot more to talk about in JavaScript, namely, if we're creating callback functions, how does JavaScript actually schedule all of these callbacks, right? And how does it work? And I really haven't even gotten to the fact that the the nice thing about JavaScript is that it's, for the most part, an asynchronous language. So it uses the resources actually in a very efficient way. So in the next demo, what I want to talk about is some kind of internal workings of JavaScript, and talk a little bit more about callbacks. And then I'm going to use that to kind of transition over to Node, because as we program in Node, it's essential to understand this idea of asynchronous programming. So I'm going to leave it there for today. And we'll get back to that in more advanced JavaScript programming in the next demo. Okay, so thank you for watching. I will see you guys next week.